This meeting is being recorded.
For the first section of chapter 16, we're going to introduce what are referred to as conjugated pi systems. And then later in the chapter, we're going to focus on a type of reaction that we are not familiar with, this pericyclic reactions here. And we've seen ionic reactions in the past, such as with SN1 mechanisms and carbocation intermediates. Then we saw in chapter 10 radical reactions with the initiation, propagation, and termination steps. So this type of reaction in chapter 16 will be a new type that we're introduced to. So let's take a quick look here at what chapter 16 entails. So we'll start in this video with a review of 16.1. We'll look at how we can form these conjugated dienes that we're introduced to. We'll review some molecular orbital theory. And then we'll look at some specific reactions, these Diels-Alder reactions, and some sigmatropic rearrangements. And there's also chapter 16, section 11 on UV-vis spectroscopy. So that's our goal for this chapter, to review these topics. And let's begin with the first section here when we're talking about dienes. So as the name implies, we have two double bonds, two pi bonds, right? So an alkene has the ene ending, and now we're going to have two of these alkenes. And when we have a conjugated system of pi bonds, we're going to see a very special functionality. And these conjugated pi bonds actually function as a single functional group. So let's look at the three different types of dienes that we might encounter. So the first here is called a cumulated diene, where we have the two double bonds, the pi bonds, will be adjacent. So we see them right next to each other. That's what that term is mentioning here. They are adjacent pi bonds. Then in our middle structure, we see that we have a pi bond here, a single bond right here, and then another pi bond here. So a conjugated diene, the specific focus of this chapter will be when we have pi bonds that are separated by a single bond, as shown in that middle structure. And then we have our last grouping of dienes here, where they are separated by more than one single bond. So these pi bonds are called isolated, and this would form an isolated diene. Another way of referring to cumulated, you might see these guys called allenes as well. So these are specific terminology for the cumulated diene. So what makes these different, these three different types of dienes different in their functionality has to do with the overlap or lack of overlap between the pi bonds. So we see in our first representation up here, this cumulated pi bond system, the pi bonds are perpendicular to one another. So we can see the red overlap here, and then the other red overlap here of the orbital. So these two pi bonds will be perpendicular, and we have a lack of what's referred to as conjugation. We'll also look at this last grouping here next, the isolated pi bonds. So we see the overlap here, this more than one single bond in the middle, and then the overlap over here. So again, there's no conjugation of these two pi bonds, and they are called isolated. But what we see in the middle here is this conjugated system of pi bonds. So this is a continuous overlap between these four carbon atoms. So this overlapping system of p orbitals actually functions as a single functional group. So that's why these conjugated dienes are a special type. And that will be the focus, again, of this chapter. There are special properties and reactivity that are associated with them. And we should note that a conjugated system can also include heteroatoms. So if you recall, a heteroatom is something other than our carbon and hydrogen. So in this case, we have this conjugated enone up top here. So we have the ene part here for the alkene, and then a ketone functional portion here. But collectively, this is considered a conjugated enone. And again, those heteroatoms can be part of conjugated systems. So we'll continue with how to form or prepare these types of dienes in the next section.